In this video we will see what soldiers during Operation Barbarossa would eat. If you enjoy these videos, please leave a like and/or subscribe. Before the first boot crossed the Soviet border on the 22nd of June, 1941, before the first Panzer engine turned over in the gray pre-dawn, before 3 million men began the largest land invasion in the history of warfare, someone had to feed them. It is a fact of military life that armies do not run on courage alone. They run on calories. And the question of what a soldier ate, how he ate it, and whether he ate it all, shaped the course of Operation Barbarossa as profoundly as any tank or aircraft or strategic decision made in a Berlin conference room. This is the story of food on the Eastern Front, of black bread and horsemeat, of ersatz coffee brewed from acorns, of tin cans warmed on the engine blocks of half-tracks, of hunger real, consuming, battlefield hunger, and of the extraordinary improvisation soldiers on both sides practiced simply to keep body and soul together. We begin in the summer of 1941, at the moment the war was still young and the fields of the Soviet Union stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering with wheat. The German soldier's ration. The Wehrmacht soldier of 1941 was, at least on paper, relatively well provisioned. German military planners had designed a field ration system, the Verpflegung, built around several categories depending on circumstance and proximity to the front. In the rear, a soldier might receive the full normal Verpflegung, the standard garrison ration. This included a generous daily allowance of bread, roughly 750 grams, which formed the absolute cornerstone of the German soldier's diet. It was a dense, dark rye bread, heavy and slightly sour, quite different from the white loaves a British or American soldier might have known. It kept well. It was filling. It could be eaten plain, smeared with margarine or schmaltz-rendered animal fat, or used to sop up the liquid at the bottom of a mess tin. A soldier learned very quickly to treat his bread ration with something approaching reverence. Alongside the bread came a daily allotment of meat, usually around 120 grams, along with fat, vegetables, and legumes. Coffee, or what passed for coffee, was issued regularly. Sugar and salt were standard. In garrison or during rest periods, field kitchens, the famous Galashkanon, or goulash cannon, as the soldiers nicknamed the rolling field cooker, would produce hot meals twice a day. A thick soup of peas or lentils, a stew of whatever meat and root vegetables were available. On good days, something approaching a recognizable meal. But Operation Barbarossa was not fought in garrison. It was fought across hundreds of miles of Soviet steppe, through swamps and forests and river crossings, at a pace that repeatedly outran the supply chain designed to support it. Speed and the collapse of supply, the genius and the fatal flaw of the German invasion plan were the same thing: speed. The blitzkrieg that had shattered France in 6 weeks was to be applied here, on a continental scale. The Soviet Union would be cut apart before it could mobilize. The campaign, Hitler and his generals expected, would last perhaps 8 weeks, perhaps 10. In that optimistic timeline, resupply was not a deep concern. Soldiers could carry their own provisions. The Eisen portion, the iron ration, was the emergency reserve each man kept on his person. It was not to be touched without an officer's order. It consisted of hard biscuits, a tin of preserved meat, and a small quantity of coffee concentrate. Simple, dense with calories, designed for exactly this kind of fast-moving warfare. In the first days, as German columns drove deep into Soviet territory, the iron ration held. Men ate from what they carried. Field kitchens labored to keep up, sometimes succeeding, sometimes falling hours or a full day behind the forward units. The soldiers accepted this. They were winning, after all. The roads, insofar as Soviet roads existed, were choked with the detritus of a fleeing army. There was an almost festival quality to those first weeks, a sense of unstoppable momentum. But the roads were worse than anyone had planned for. The Soviet rail gauge was different from the European standard, meaning captured lines had to be laboriously relayed before German supply trains could use them. The distances were unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in Western Europe. France, from the Rhine to the Atlantic, is perhaps 600 kilometers. From the Soviet border to Moscow is more than 1,000. And the Soviet Union did not end at Moscow. By late July, supply lines were already beginning to strain. Hot meals became irregular. The iron ration was eaten, orders or no orders, and not always replaced. Soldiers began supplementing their rations in whatever way they could. Living off the land, the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 was, in places, extraordinarily abundant. The Ukrainians stepped the region the Germans called the cornkammer. The breadbasket of Europe was in full agricultural production. Collective farm fields stretched to the horizon, heavy with sunflowers and wheat. Orchards sagged with unripe fruit. Villages, often abandoned in the face of the German advance, left behind root cellars stocked with preserves, dried mushrooms, salted fish, and root vegetables. German soldiers, moving through this landscape, supplemented their dwindling rations with whatever they could find. Green apples, eaten before they were ready, caused epidemic stomach trouble in the early weeks of the campaign. Cucumbers, tomatoes, and onions from kitchen gardens were consumed raw, standing in the field. Chickens were caught and killed. Pigs were slaughtered. A soldier who had never cooked a meal in his life learned rapidly to improvise over an open fire. This foraging was not entirely sanctioned, but it was widely tolerated, then quietly encouraged. The army could not reliably feed its men. The men had to feed themselves. For many soldiers, it was the sunflower that became the defining flavor of the summer campaign. The fields of Ukraine were planted with them in vast quantities grown for their oil, a Soviet staple. Soldiers walked through the tall stalks cracking seeds between their teeth, filling their pockets and helmet liners with the heads, eating as they marched. The habit spread through entire divisions. Decades later, veterans of the Eastern Front would describe the smell of sunflowers and immediately be transported back to that summer, to the dust and the heat and the interminable Eastern roads. The Soviet soldier's ration. On the other side of the line, the Red Army soldier faced a very different situation, though one equally shaped by crisis. The Soviet military ration the pack was, in theory, carefully calibrated. A frontline soldier was entitled to 900 grams of bread per day, along with meat, fish, fat, vegetables, and a small allowance of sugar and tobacco. Tobacco, in fact, was treated as nearly as essential as food itself. The makorka, a coarse, rough-cut tobacco smoked in newspaper, was a fundamental comfort of Soviet military life. But in the summer of 1941, theory and reality had catastrophically diverged. The German advance had been so swift, so devastating, that entire Soviet armies were encircled within weeks. Supply depots were overrun or destroyed. Field kitchens were captured or abandoned. In the great encirclement battles at Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves cut off, not just from reinforcement, but from food entirely. In the Minsk pocket alone, more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the first 10 days. Many of them had not eaten properly in days before their capture. The rations they surrendered were, in many cases, already exhausted. For those who escaped encirclement and fell back in the great retreats of that summer, hunger was a constant companion. Soldiers ate grass, boiled leather, dug for roots, a handful of millet cooked with swamp water, whatever could be found. The Soviet soldier of 1941 was fighting not just the Wehrmacht but the constant, grinding attrition of an empty stomach. The Rasputitsa. The Soviet Union had a weapon that appeared on no German map and featured in no Wehrmacht briefing document. It was called the Rasputitsa. The word translates, roughly, as the season of bad roads. In practice, it meant something more absolute than that. It meant the end of roads entirely. The Soviet steppe was underlaid in many regions with a soil the locals called Chernozem, black earth, famously fertile, the reason Ukraine had fed empires for centuries. But Chernozem, when saturated with rain, does not become mud in the ordinary sense. It becomes something closer to glue, a thick, clinging, boot-swallowing paste that could stop a horse, bog a vehicle to its axles, and reduce the pace of an entire army group to a crawl. The autumn rains came in October. Within days, the roads already poor, already churned by 3 months of heavy military traffic, ceased to function. Trucks sank to their running boards. Supply columns that might have taken a day to travel a given distance now took a week, if they moved at all. And this meant one thing above all else: food stopped arriving. For the German soldier at the front, the Rasputitsa transformed the already strained supply situation into something close to crisis. Hot meals, never guaranteed, now became exceptional events. The field kitchens were somewhere behind, mired in the same mud as everything else. What food there was arrived cold, late, and in reduced quantity. Bread rations were cut. Meat rations were cut. The ersatz coffee, already a thin substitute, was sometimes replaced with hot water alone. Men began to lose weight. Not the gradual softening of a body adjusting to hard conditions, but the visible, rapid wasting that comes from sustained caloric deficit. Uniforms that had fitted in June hung loose by October. The sunflower seeds that had seemed like a pleasant supplement in July were now, when they could be found at all, a meaningful contribution to a man's daily intake. Foraging under pressure. The villages of Western Russia and Ukraine had already been picked over by the time the autumn mud set in. The early weeks of the campaign, when German soldiers had helped themselves to chickens and cucumbers and root cellar preserves, had left many settlements stripped of their food surplus. The civilian populations, already brutally disrupted by the invasion, were themselves facing hunger. What remained was harder to find and harder to prepare. Soldiers dug potatoes from fields that had not been fully harvested, scraping them from the cold ground with their hands or their bayonets. A potato, boiled in a mess tin over a small fire, with a scraping of margarine if any remained, could be the best meal a man had eaten in days. It was noted in letters home, described with a kind of reverent detail that in peacetime would have been reserved for a restaurant meal. Mushrooms were gathered where they could be found. The forests of the Soviet Union were abundant with them, and many soldiers, particularly those from rural German backgrounds, knew which varieties were safe. A mushroom soup, made with whatever else was available, became a standard improvisation of the autumn campaign. Wild game was hunted when ammunition could be spared and time permitted. Hares, occasionally deer, in swampy areas, ducks and waterfowl. None of this was enough to substitute for a proper ration, but it filled gaps, added protein, and perhaps as importantly gave men something to do, something to pursue, a small act of agency in a situation that otherwise felt entirely beyond their control. In this foraging, soldiers on both sides were doing something humans have done throughout the history of warfare, converting the landscape itself into sustenance. The Eastern Front, vast and mostly rural, offered more possibility for this than the industrial battlefields of the First World War had. But it was never enough. It was never more than the difference between severe hunger and something slightly less severe. The question of horse. By autumn 1941, horses were dying in considerable numbers on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht, often imagined in the popular memory as a fully mechanized force, was in fact heavily dependent on horse-drawn transport. More than 600,000 horses had crossed the Soviet border in June. They pulled artillery. They hauled supply wagons over roads that would have defeated motor vehicles. They were, in a sense, the logistical backbone of a campaign that liked to think of itself as modern. And they were dying. From exhaustion, from overwork, from the mud, from the cold that was beginning to descend in October, from wounds, from disease. A horse that died on the Eastern Front in 1941 did not go to waste for long. Horsemeat became a significant and increasingly routine part of the German soldiers' diet in the autumn and winter of 1941. It was prepared in every way imaginable, boiled into soup, fried in whatever fat was available, dried and eaten cold, ground and mixed with flour to make a rough kind of sausage. It was nutritious. It was available. And soldiers, hungry enough, came to appreciate it without sentiment. There was, initially, some resistance. Horsemeat was not a common food in Germany, and a soldier who might have been squeamish about it in civilian life had to make a rapid adjustment. The adjustment was almost universally made. Hunger is a more persuasive argument than any cultural preference. The liver and the kidneys were considered the prize richer, more flavorful, more immediately nourishing. Officers and enlisted men alike competed for them. A soldier who managed to secure the liver of a fallen artillery horse had done well for himself, and he knew it. The Soviet soldier in autumn. For the Red Army soldier, the autumn of 1941 brought its own particular ordeal, different in texture from the German experience, but no less hungry. The Red Army's supply system had not collapsed entirely, as it had in the encirclement disasters of the summer, but it was badly damaged and desperately overstretched. Soviet industrial and agricultural capacity was in the process of a massive eastward migration. Entire factories were being dismantled and moved beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach, but this meant that the productive capacity of the Soviet economy was temporarily reduced at the moment it was most needed. The bread that reached Soviet soldiers in the autumn was often of poor quality, adulterated with corn flour, potato flour, or rice. A surviving account from a Soviet infantryman describes bread so dense and heavy with impurities that it had to be cut with a bayonet. It sat in the stomach like clay. But it was calories. He ate it. The Soviet military ration had, by autumn, acquired a new and controversial element, alcohol. A daily allowance of 100 grams of vodka, sometimes replaced with a rough-grained spirit, was introduced for frontline troops in October 1941. The NAK, the People's Commissar's 100 grams. It was called, named after Voroshilov, the defense commissar. It was intended to provide warmth, combat fatigue, and shore up morale. It became one of the defining rituals of Soviet military life, the daily ration of spirit, shared between men, knocked back in a single movement before an assault or at the end of a bitter day. Whether it was good policy is another question, but it was something. In a diet that was otherwise growing grimmer by the week, the vodka ration was hot, immediate, and human. Soldiers looked forward to it. Bread, and what it meant. It is worth pausing, here, in the mud and the dwindling rations of October 1941, to consider what bread meant to the people of this conflict on both sides. In Germany, bread was the foundation of the diet, the thing around which all other food revolved. The enormous variety of German breads, the dark rise, the sourdoughs, the dense whole-grain loaves, were a point of cultural pride, deeply woven into daily life. A soldier's longing for good bread was not merely physical. It was a longing for home, for normalcy, for a kitchen table and a morning that did not begin with the sound of artillery. In Russia and Ukraine, bread carried an even deeper weight. The Soviet state had collectivized agriculture in the 1930s, and the famines that followed, particularly the Holodomor in Ukraine, had made bread, its presence or absence, a matter of life and death within living memory. For a Soviet soldier, bread was not simply food. It was survival itself, encoded in the body and the culture at a level below conscious thought. Both sides, then, fighting across a landscape of grain fields, were waging a war in which bread was simultaneously weapon, prize, and ghost. The Germans had invaded the breadbasket of Europe. The Soviet people were defending it. And in the autumn of 1941, with the mud rising and the supply lines fraying and the first cold winds arriving from the east, both armies were running short of it. There is a temperature at which bread freezes solid. It is not a particularly low temperature, just a few degrees below zero will do it, given enough time. And in the winter of 1941, on the Eastern Front, that temperature arrived in November and did not leave for months. Bread that had been baked in a field kitchen 20 miles behind the line arrived at the front as a dense, rock-hard block that could not be cut, could not be torn, and could not be eaten without first being thawed. Soldiers held slices against their bodies, tucking them inside their tunics, warming them against their skin. They broke pieces off with their rifle butts. They melted them over candle flames, a centimeter at a time, and ate the results still half-cold. This is what winter meant on the Eastern Front in 1941. Not merely cold as discomfort, cold as a force that reached into every aspect of daily existence, including the most fundamental act of eating. The winter nobody planned for. The German High Command had not issued winter clothing to its soldiers on the Eastern Front. This single fact, more than almost any other, encapsulates the catastrophic overconfidence of the Barbarossa planning. The campaign was supposed to be over before the cold came. The soldiers were supposed to be in billets by October, the Soviet Union defeated, the supply problems solved by the simple fact of victory. Instead, they were in the open, in November, then December, in temperatures that dropped to -20, -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Men who had fought through the summer in cotton tunics now faced conditions for which they were utterly unprepared in every sense: clothing, equipment, and food alike. The caloric demands of operating in extreme cold are enormous. A body working to maintain its core temperature in sub-zero conditions burns far more energy than the same body in a temperate climate. German soldiers, already on reduced rations due to the supply crisis of the autumn, were now burning more calories than ever while receiving fewer. The arithmetic was punishing. Fat became the most precious commodity on the Eastern Front, not in the nutritional sense of a dietary preference, but in the immediate, physical, survival sense. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient available. It burns slowly. It insulates. It keeps a body warm from the inside. Soldiers who could get their hands on animal fat from horse meat, from whatever livestock remained in the villages, from captured Soviet rations, ate it as directly and deliberately as medicine. Lard spread thickly on a piece of thawed bread was not a luxury. It was a calculation. The art of the mess tin, in conditions where a hot meal was now not merely irregular but genuinely rare. The mess tin became the center of a soldier's culinary world. It was used for everything: melting snow for drinking water, boiling whatever scraps of food were available, thawing frozen bread, brewing the ersatz coffee that still, in diminishing quantities, made its way to the front. Ersatz coffee deserves a moment of attention, because it tells a particular story about the German war economy in microcosm. Real coffee had been a luxury in Germany since before the war: imported, expensive, rationed. The military received a substitute, a blend of roasted barley, chicory, acorn, and various other plant materials that, when brewed, produced a dark, bitter liquid that resembled coffee primarily in color and temperature. Soldiers called it Muckfuck, a term of cheerful contempt that had been in use in Germany since the 19th century. It was not good, but it was hot, and in the winter of 1941, hot was everything. A cup of Muckfuck held in both hands, the warmth of it radiating through wool gloves or bare frostbitten fingers, was more than a drink. It was a moment of pause in conditions that otherwise offered very little. Soldiers described these moments in letters home with a specificity that suggests how intensely they were felt. The heat of the tin against the palm, the smell of roasting grain, the brief, animal comfort of something warm in the stomach. Around the mess tin, small communities formed. 2 or 3 men sharing a fire, sharing the heat, taking turns stirring the contents of a communal pot. Cooking, or the closest approximation to it available in those conditions, became a social act. It was something to organize, to anticipate, to discuss. What was in the pot? Who had contributed what? Whether the horse meat had been simmered long enough? Whether there was enough salt? These conversations, minor and domestic in their substance, were in fact acts of psychological survival. They kept men human in conditions designed to reduce them to something less. Leningrad, the siege and the bread. While the German armies shivered and rationed on the open steppe, in the north a very different and far more terrible food story was unfolding. Leningrad, the former St. Petersburg, the second city of the Soviet Union, had been surrounded by German and Finnish forces in September 1941. The siege that followed would last nearly 900 days. But in the winter of 1941, the first winter, it reached its most acute and deadly phase. By November, the food supply to the city had been almost entirely cut off. The only remaining route was across Lake Ladoga, and in November, the lake was not yet fully frozen. The ice was too thin for trucks, too broken for boats. For several weeks, Leningrad was functionally cut off from all supply. The city's food reserves, already depleted, began to run out. The bread ration for civilian workers in November 1941 was reduced to 250 grams per day. For dependents' children, the elderly, those not engaged in war work, it fell to 125 grams. 125 grams of bread. Hold that weight in your mind. It is roughly the size of a small bread roll. It was all that stood between a human being and starvation for a day. And the bread itself was not ordinary bread. The flour ran out. What replaced it was a mixture that was called bread but shared little with the thing the word normally described. Sawdust was added as a filler, genuine cellulose from processed wood pulp, which provided bulk but no nutrition. Cottonseed cake, normally used as animal feed, was incorporated. Wallpaper paste, scraped from the walls of buildings, was used as a binder. The resulting loaves were dark, gummy, and faintly bitter. They fell apart when cut. They provided barely enough calories to sustain life, and in many cases they did not provide quite enough. People died in the streets of Leningrad. They died in their apartments, in their workplaces, in queues for bread. They died at night, in their sleep, their bodies finally surrendering to a hunger that had been building for weeks. The official death toll from starvation and cold in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 to 1942 is estimated at several 100,000 people. The true figure may have been higher. What kept some people alive in those months was ingenuity of a very dark kind. Wallpaper was boiled for the paste in it, the same paste that was being used in the bread, now extracted from the walls directly. Leather belts and boots were boiled, the resulting liquid drunk as a kind of broth. Library paste and carpenter's glue were consumed. Pets, dogs, cats, birds disappeared from the city. People who had been cultured and comfortable and thoroughly urban discovered that hunger dissolves civilization faster than almost anything else, and that the body's demand for calories is not a negotiation. In this context, the daily bread ration, 125 grams of sawdust flour composite, took on a significance that is almost impossible to overstate. It was fetched in person, clutched carefully, never wasted. Crumbs were gathered from the table and eaten. The wrapping, if there was one, was licked clean. This was not desperation as a temporary state. This was the texture of daily life in Leningrad for months. The road of life. In December 1941, Lake Ladoga froze sufficiently for vehicles to cross. The Soviet authorities organized a supply route across the ice, the Doroga Jizny, the road of life, driving trucks loaded with food into the city and returning with evacuees. The trucks drove without headlights, in the dark, on ice that cracked and shifted beneath them. Drivers kept their cab doors open so that they could jump clear if the ice gave way. Some trucks went through. Drivers drowned in the black water of the lake in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, trying to carry flour to a starving city. The road of life did not end the siege of Leningrad. It began, slowly and imperfectly, to ease it. Rations increased marginally. The rate of death from starvation, which had been reaching catastrophic levels in December, began gradually, painfully to slow. But the road of life is also, in its way, the fullest expression of what food meant in this conflict. That human beings would drive trucks across cracking ice in winter darkness to deliver bread. That other human beings would wait for that bread, and ration it, and guard it, and eat it one careful crumb at a time. That the question of whether enough flour could be moved across a frozen lake was, for hundreds of thousands of people, the question of whether they would live or die. An ending, of sorts. Operation Barbarossa, as a formal campaign, is generally considered to have ended in December 1941, when the German advance ground to a halt before Moscow and the Soviet winter counteroffensive began. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for another 3.5 years. The hunger, the improvisation, the frozen bread and the horsemeat and the ersatz coffee and the 125-gram ration, all of it would continue too, in different forms, through different seasons, until the final collapse of 1945. But the winter of 1941 was where it became clear, to those who were willing to see it, that this war would not be decided quickly. The supply lines had failed. The iron rations were eaten. The sunflowers of Ukraine were a summer memory, half a year and half a continent away. What remained was hunger, endurance, and the small, fierce human insistence on finding something, anything to put in the mess tin and call a meal. Soldiers on both sides, in their letters and their diaries, returned again and again to food, to what they had eaten that day, or had not eaten, to what they missed from home, to specific meals, specific flavors of mother's soup, a wife's bread, the particular taste of a sausage from a particular town. Food, in extremity, becomes memory and hope simultaneously. It connects the present body, cold and hungry, to a past self that was warm and fed, and to a future self that might be again. That imagined future meal simple, warm, at a table, with people you love may have been, for many of the men who survived the Eastern Front, the thing that kept them walking forward through the snow. For those who did not survive, it was the last thing they were still hoping for. This concludes the video. Thank you for listening.